Hello, colleagues. If you can hear me, my name is Oscar Mwanga. I am the Program Director for the International Sports Management at the University of London Worldwide. Today, I have a rare privilege and honor to introduce a colleague, an elder sister in the field that I'm working in recently, the field of decolonizing education. Today's the session we have is the last keynote for today, but it's really perfect because the theme is so important. Today, I'm introducing Professor Anne Lopez from the University of Toronto. But before I do that, I'll just like to mention that co-chairing with me is another colleague of mine that I've been working with at the University of Toronto, looking at decolonization, and that is Dr. Anita Skinner. So before I really give the sort of like the background to introduce Professor Anne Lopez, I just want to give a little bit of context to what we're trying to do here. I joined the University of London Worldwide in 2019, just before COVID, and coming out of the field of sport for sustainable development, my interest has really been looking at how we can work through the problematic of decolonization. So I had an opportunity to be introduced to colleagues of mine, Linda and Simon and the others that have just been very kind to help me find my ground in how I can incorporate this work into distance education. So I applied for a grant in CDC then that would help me to do this work. So I managed to get that grant, and that has been a big part of what I've been trying to do, working with colleagues around this area. So the need for us to decolonize at the University of London has been was awakened during the Black Lives Matter that happened in the US and then spilled over here to the UK. According to the Guardian report, only 24 out of 128 universities in the UK are decolonizing their curriculum in a structured and systematic way. So joining the University of London, it was important for me to try and see how would I situate this work that we are doing. And this grant, the Teaching and Research Award that I got, was a great support to help me to do that work. But why was that important? Why is it important that we try to centralize this work? Well, for starters, it's important because in the global knowledge industry, we as the University of London sit in a very privileged place, and we are actually sitting in a place where English and Western knowledge is privileged more than other forms of knowing. But also we have over 50,000 students, mostly located in the former Commonwealth countries where my native country sits, which is Zambia, who have been exposed to an education system that actually is not indigenous and is Western. And it's important for us to think and accept that actually we are deep-rooted into the colonial legacy of the British Empire. So following from that, we are duty-bound. We have the responsibility to try and look at how do we help our 50,000 students to decolonize their education experience and to help them liberate their futures as they look forward to empower themselves and their communities. And one of the things that has come out of this study that I did with a few colleagues is that we need to collaborate internationally in our work. And the work that I'm currently involved in is to collaborate with a university in Zambia called Kwame Nkrumah University and University of Toronto. And through that connection, I was introduced to my colleague and now a mentor in the name of Professor Anne Lopez. So Professor Anne Lopez is from the University of Toronto. She's an educational leader. She's in the educational leadership department at OISE, and she's also the Director of Leadership and Diversity and Advisor to Access Programs. Dr. Lopez has held a number of positions that you have clearly seen in her profile. She's a former secondary school teacher herself, and at OISE she's been involved in research that looks at anti-racist, anti-colonial education, decolonizing and socially just leadership, issues of equity and education. She has published widely in the area, and her recent book is Decolonizing Educational Leadership, Alternative Approach to Leading Schools. Dr. Lopez is also a co-editor of the Journal of leadership, school leadership, and also in a number of editorials like that. She is a recipient of the 2020 Award for Distinguished Contribution to Teaching and 2022 Just Memorial Human Rights Prize for Influential Leaders. Now, that is what we have formally on paper, but for me, I see a transformational leader, a visionary educator, and a spiritual elder sister whose engagement in the decolonization of education continues to illuminate my own path and enters this decolonizing space with a positive energy, a compelling humility and authenticity, and a critical and analytical engagement and a praxis approach to her work. Her lived experience as a Black woman, an educator and academic, she brings that, and she's never shy to mention that her ancestors are part of her work, and I'm inspired by that. So without ever further ado, I'm introducing my colleague and the mentor, Ann Lopez, for this keynote entitled Decolonizing as a Driver of Critical Change in Online and Distance Education, Possibilities and Tensions. And your show. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Mwanga. It's just an absolute pleasure to be here and to be invited into space. I'm going to take this opportunity now to share my slides before I go into what I want to say today. So good day to everyone who's joined us from wherever you might be coming from. It might be in London, or it might be other areas across the globe. But first, let me thank Dr. Linda Armani Cooper, Director of the Academic Practice in Distance Education at the University of London Worldwide. And as I've said, my brother, Dr. Oscar Mwanga, Program Director, University of London Worldwide, and the Center for Online and Distance Education for inviting me to speak at the RIDE 2022. I truly, truly appreciate that and really look forward to this engagement, I think, on a topic that I would say is really current, and in the discourse now. Now, before I begin, it's so important for me to have an Indigenous and an ancestral land acknowledgement. And it's really not a performative act. It's something that we truly do. Those of us who are engaging in decolonizing work, we begin by acknowledging our connection to space. And what does that mean for us? And so at the University of Toronto, and in Canada, that's what we do. So I'm going to start. I'm coming to you from Toronto. I'm in the region of Peel. And so I'm going to be sharing the land acknowledgement for the land on which I am at. And while I'm doing this, I'm going to invite everyone that is with us to begin to think about where they are standing, the land that they're standing on. And that's an important part and aspect of decolonizing work as well. So I would like to begin by acknowledging the land on which I am standing, which is part of the region of Peel in Canada, is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And for thousands of years, Indigenous peoples inhabited and cared for this land and continue to do so today. In particular, I acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Ojibwe Chippewa peoples, the land that is home to the Métis, and most recently, the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who are direct descendants of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I am, as an immigrant to Canada, I'm truly grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And by doing so, I give my respect to the first inhabitants. Decolonizing work, as Dr. Mwanga says, really connects us to our histories. And so I would also, as a descendant of the enslaved, and I was recently in Ghana, and I have visited those dungeons from which my ancestors were taken. So I, as I start this keynote today, want to acknowledge the labor of our African ancestors and the many contributions they made and continue to make in creating space in Canada and across borders and across the globe. I want to think of my ancestors who were forcibly taken, not by choice, but forcibly taken from their land. I want to also be mindful of the lineage and the sacrifice of African people in the struggle for racial and social justice. And as I do this, I want to take this moment as an opportunity to pause, to reflect, and to continue to educate myself on the contributions of Black people everywhere and my ancestors, and particularly as it relates to education. And in doing so, I strive to uphold and support relationship building with Indigenous communities and look forward to reimagining or shared futurism. So I just want to thank you so much for allowing me to do that. And if we're going to be talking about decolonization, it is so very important that we acknowledge the space and the ancestral lands. And so as I was invited into space today to talk about decolonizing education and the possibilities for distance learning and online learning, I was really impressed and really connected and drawn to the conference theme. And what stood out for me in the conference theme is the whole idea of people, pedagogy, and practice. Wow. And I thought, what a beautiful way of bringing together all that is so very important as we talk about and reimagine ways and imagine ways that we can engage in decolonizing education and begin to think about what that means. And because it involves people. Education, online, distance, or face-to-face or other forms of teaching and learning does not happen without people. And the people, it's the educators, it's our students, it's our communities, it's all of us in this collaborative effort. The pedagogy is important because that's the how and why of what we teach. It doesn't matter where we're teaching and the format in which we're teaching. It is the how and why. It revolves around those decisions that educators make in that ongoing teaching and learning process. And we're going to begin by asking some questions about that, particularly within the context of distance and online education. And really, as we begin to think about decolonization, what that means, and how we might begin to be intentional, about including it in the work that we do or using it as a framing. And of course, the practice. And some of us might say the praxis, but the practice is so very important because that is how we put ideas into action. You know, it's very easy as educators to sit in theory, to sit in the deconstructing of notions and ideas and concepts. But how do we translate that into action? And again, of course, as I reflect on, and I spent a lot of time reflecting on the themes of this conference, on the theme for the conference. And so as I reflected on what might the practice be? What might the practice of decolonizing education be in online and distance education? What might that be? What might it look like? What do we need to see? And so that's sort of the entry point that I'm going to be using for this keynote today. So, and when we're engaging in this work, for me, it's not about a doctrine. It is about asking those big questions about people, pedagogy, and practice. What needs to change? How do I need to make that shift? Not only in my thinking, but also in my doing. And so I'm going to invite everyone to begin to think about, therefore, as I talk about decolonizing education, to think about the possibilities for online and distance learning. And some of us might be doing it already. So it is building on what we're doing. It might be enriching. It might be reimagining, reconceptualizing. And so I think it's so very important for us to begin to ask those questions of the possibilities, because it is the possibilities that allow us to reimagine. It is the possibilities that allow us to question. It is the possibilities that reimagine us, thinking about those possibilities that allow us to begin to reconceptualize and begin to put that into practice and to begin to think about the impact. We might also want to begin to think about and to ask some questions around what role then might decolonizing education play in or rethinking as we think about these big questions for online and distance learning within a decolonizing frame. So I really, really encourage all of us who are listening, who are engaging with us in this conference, to really begin to think about your own practice. As I'm going through this, begin to think about your own practice, begin to think about your entry points, begin to think about areas for change. But before we can do that, because decolonization is really, in today's discourse, really, I would say it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. Many people are talking about it, and that's great. I think it's wonderful. It's really, I think, very exciting, actually, that so many educators are talking about decolonizing their curriculum, the pedagogy, higher education, and so on. And we are here today reflecting on what that might mean for online and distance learning. But so there are many, many ways to think about decolonizing education, but there are some things that I think are central. There's some things that are central, and there are also some cautions that I want to also bring to mind as well. And so the first thing I want to say about decolonizing education, as I use that to ground my conversations with you, is that it's a process of undoing colonizing practices and really challenging coloniality as well. And I really want to pause here, because I think it's Tuck and Yang who says we must be careful that decolonizing doesn't become a metaphor. And I think as we reflect on that in 2022, I think it's a good caution. It's a good caution to be mindful of. It's a good caution as we begin to take up this work more deeply, as we begin to think about this work in different ways, that we're mindful that we're not just labeling things as decolonization or decolonizing, but that we're actually questioning what we're doing. And so I think that's an important reminder that it's a process as well. You know, it's going to happen over time, because colonization happened over many, many years in education and schooling. And we're not going to go through today some of those practices, because I think most of us know them. But I think it's so important for us to be very intentional as we think about decolonization, decolonizing, that what we're doing is sort of undoing those colonial practices. So I urge everyone to think about what practices might you be engaging in that might be a remnant of that. And then therefore, that will lead us to the displacement of the colonial logic. And now what do I mean by that? Is this idea, as we're doing whether education and schooling or higher ed or online learning and distance learning, that in what ways might we be perpetuating a colonial logic in curriculum, in theory, in practice, in pedagogy, and so on? And I think that is very, very important for us to think about as well. And so it's really challenging what it means and confronting those practices that have influenced education in the past, and some of which are still present today. And of course, as I've said before, it takes on different meanings in different contexts. You know, practices are not the same everywhere. So online and distance education might be a little bit different in London than it is, say, in Toronto, or in places in the global south where the students are coming from, what that might be. What does that context look like? Who are the students that we're serving? All of those questions, as we're thinking about a decolonizing framework and decolonizing logic, we have to think about. And data also reminds us that when we talk about decolonizing education, it is nurturing those capacities to reimagine or to imagine alternatives to the way we're doing business, alternative in ways that we're thinking about curriculum, alternative ways in which we're looking at power relations between educators and our students in our courses. It reimagine ways to think about institutional structures. And I think it's so very important for that to be centered in our conversations today, that decolonization also creates that space for us to think about alternatives to the work that we're doing, confronting and challenging, as I've said before, practices and policies that have influenced education, the curriculum, the pedagogy, and so on. There's something I really want to point out as well, as we're talking about decolonizing education and focusing on online and distance learning, is how we think about space and place. How do we think about that? When we are creating online courses or distance education, what does that look like? Because then that becomes the space. Even though it's virtual, it becomes a space. What happens in that space? And I know, as we were thinking and talking about the pandemic and learning from the pandemic, one of the things that came up in as many sort of pivoted to online and distance education was the whole idea of the camera. How does learning occur when cameras are on and off? And not just the power distinctions within cameras being on and off, but do we understand the spaces that our students are in while they're participating online? And therefore, when we're asking folks to put on cameras on and off, decolonization requires us to then think about that space and how we engage in that space. And so it's really, I think, maybe a key piece that maybe we can have some further conversations about in the Q&A. And that then leads us to this idea of having authentic and respectful connections to community. So when we're engaging in this online and distance work, and we're doing that, and we're drawing in participants and students, and others might not necessarily be students, learners into the online and distance learning space, when we're thinking through a decolonizing lens, how are we thinking about the communities where those folks are coming from, and what do we need to do, and what do we need to understand? I think it's also important to think about that decolonization also involves reflecting on the structure of education and how it is delivered. And so as you're creating your online courses or your distance education, what does that look like? What are the pieces are you bringing together? And how are those pieces that you're bringing together disrupting and challenging colonial practices or practices that we have taken for granted, that we have normalized? It also involves continuing reflection. And that piece is really crucial. It's really crucial that is this continued ongoing learning, reimagining, rethinking, redoing that is central to decolonizing work. And of course, as I've mentioned before, challenging and examining those power dynamics as we're in that space. And something that's so very important, we often say this as educators, we say this constantly, that we're educating the whole person, not just the intellect. But when we talk about decolonizing education within that context, what does that mean? And this is where, when Tuck and Yang says it should not be a metaphor, that's what they're saying. It cannot simply be a theory. What does it mean in practice? What does it mean in action? How do we know that we're engaging in it and not just paying lip service or being performative? And so that means moving away from the one-size-fits-all approach to teaching and learning, and really meeting the needs of individual students. And so, again, what might the assessments look like? What does the evaluation looks like? How are we bringing that together? All of that is decolonizing work. Because when we begin to reflect on assessments in the online distance learning space within a decolonizing framework, it's going to mean that we cannot continue to have assessments that we've used for the last 20 years that we know oftentimes disadvantage certain students and certain learners, I would like to say. And as we're doing this and going through this work, it's so important that we also include and validate students' experiences. And so, as I've said, decolonization, therefore, involves this continuous reflection on practice. And it was really important for me as I sort of reflected on what I was going to be talking about today. What was going to be my entry point? What was going to be my entry point of engaging in decolonizing thinking and work and practice within the online distance learning area? And so it was really important for me to connect that praxis. So to connect the theorizing of decolonization to offer possibilities and suggestions, and really to say to those who are listening with us today, here are some ways that you might think about it. And I have some authors here listing on my screen. I really encourage you to read Absalon and Ashton Batiste. Batiste is from Canada, an Indigenous scholar. Amazing folks are writing about decolonization education, writing about decolonization. And I think those resources are very important to have as well as we engage in this work and really try to have that impact. So then I want to take a little bit of a deeper dive. What does decolonizing then mean within the context of distance education? And I just want to build on sort of some of the ideas that I was just sharing. And it's because it's so important as we think about empowering students, as we think about drawing on their cultural knowledge, as we think about education in a whole way, not in a vacuum. I think it's so very important to begin then to think about what are the possibilities. And so this is how I would like to position decolonizing education or decolonization within the context of online distance education. Is offering possibilities and not best practices. This is not a how it should be done, but really it's an invitation. It's an invitation to say, here are some things that we should be thinking about. And Sanchez reminds us of that. Because if we continue in education to structure best practices and hand them out, in many ways, Sanchez is saying to us that we are reproducing the very colonial logic that we're trying to disrupt. So I encourage everyone who is listening, who might be thinking about taking up their decolonizing work, decolonizing their curriculum, to really, and as you're encouraging others, to think about it and say to them what possibilities it offers to you. Think of your entry points, what might be different. I also want to say that we should think about what we've learned during the pandemic, asking questions about whose knowledge, which knowledge needs to be decentered and which knowledge needs to be centered. So if you're teaching your course and you've been doing this course for over, maybe you've done it for a year, 2 years, 3 years, and you've centered a particular kind of knowledge, I'm encouraging you as you begin to think about decolonization, begin to think about, look at your course outline, look at who you're citing on the reading list, say, which voices are missing? Which voices do I need to center and which voices do I need to decenter? Am I in my course outline representing mainly scholars who represent Eurocentric knowledge and ways of knowing? Where are the scholars from the global South? Where are the scholars from the continent of Africa? And I say the continent of Africa deliberately because we have a way of reducing Africa to one thing as a monolith. It's a big continent with 53 or 54 countries, which I think is oftentimes lost sometimes in the discourse as people speak of Africa as a monolith. So that's very important. Where is that knowledge from all of the many cultures and ethnicities and tribes and languages from the great big continent, where is that centered in your work? All of that, all of those possibilities, that is what decolonization is all about. So I see decolonization as a living, ongoing process. It's something that's part of what I do and we should all do every day. And so I want to draw your attention to this because I found this quote really, really very helpful. And it came from Woodford, and it was from her thesis. And she says, decolonizing online education prevents more challenges as courses are delivered in a variety of formats to students who may or may not even live in the countries from where we teach from. So sit with that for a minute and think about it. So here it is, really the linking of decolonization to those opportunities for educational advancement. And I think sometimes we forget when we're doing equity work, when we're doing decolonization work, that it must be linked to students' educational advancement and outcome, to their thriving, to their betterment. It's not just an organizing concept. It's not just something that liberals do. It really is important work. It is valuable and it's important to the educational outcomes of our students. So I really was drawn to this quote from Woodward. And she goes on to say, as educators, we may have less sense of what their lived experiences as students is and need to be more attuned to creating a learning environment that challenges how we would teach in a face-to-face classroom. So what we do in a face-to-face classroom might not necessarily be transferable to the way we do online teaching. So we can't just put content online and say, this is the course. And that is a call to action. Decolonization is a call to action. So I'm hoping that there are some takeaways. There are some actionable pieces that people can be with us today can begin to say, oh, okay, I need to go revisit my course and to make sure that I'm thinking about these things and I'm asking these questions. And I have the reference there for you if you wanted to see some more of Erin's work and to read her paper. And so within the online distance education, decolonizing involves educators asking questions about equity and how technology is used. So decolonization creates greater equity. And when we have greater equity, there is improved educational outcomes for learners. Higher education, K-12, wherever we may be, but we're focused here on higher ed. So yes, we make those connections. And that is very important. In today's world, we talk about learners and students being able to thrive. They need to do more than just belonging. They need to feel that their voices, their histories are present in what we're doing. So we have to ask questions about the curriculum, the content, examine the power of the instructor in teaching and in the teaching and learning space. Ask questions around how to build relationship with students, what needs to be unlearned, learned, and relearned. And I'm going to say this again, decolonizing education, whether it's in online, face-to-face, and distance education, as we call it sometimes, it is about us educators asking questions about what we need to unlearn, what we need to relearn, and what we need to learn. There's some things that we need to learn. And we need to learn these things about student experiences, about their communities, about their histories. And then we need to be intentional. I really want that word to be there. The intentionality. Decolonization cannot be an ad hoc approach. There has to be an intentionality around embracing it, using it as a framework, understanding it, making it living, alive, and well, because we know we're doing it because we know that it works. We're doing it because we know that that is what's going to make education more relevant for others. And so it is very important that we think about the online distance education teaching space that we ask these questions. And so as I sort of wrap up, and I'm watching the time here, it's just about 20 minutes. So I want to leave this therefore as the big questions. Remember, I said it's not a set list of best practices I wanted to share with you. I wanted to offer possibilities. And that in of itself is a decolonizing approach. So what big questions will be asked, therefore, about online distance education within a decolonizing framework? What big questions? And more who some of you might know, and who some of you have used his work. He's really a scholar well known within the online distance education field. And he talks about that the enthusiasm for new technology is a problem. That because what is known about education at a distance is organization, philosophies, and issues are not technologically specific. That's such an important point that Moore is making. And so that gives us an entry point when we ask those questions to engage in decolonizing work. So therefore, he says, whose starting point is the technology of the internet cut themselves off from knowing what is known about distance education. And that is the people. I go right back to your theme, people, pedagogy, and practice. And I just think more in really reminding us as we think about online and distance education to really keep that in mind. And so that is an entry point for doing this decolonizing work. And in 1993, it's a long time ago, but he really, in many ways, had thought about this. And I really like this. I really, really like this when he said that distance education systems consist of all of the components, processes that make up distance education, including, and I have them highlighted in red for a reason, because I think these are going to be the pieces that are interrogated, the pieces that are deconstructed as we continue this conversation, asking those big questions about online distance education within a decolonizing framework. What are we going to learn, unlearn, and relearn about learning? What are we going to learn, unlearn, and relearn about community? What are we going to learn, unlearn, and relearn about designing courses and management of courses? And of course, Moore says it's also about history. So the question, therefore, is what are we going to do about including the histories? And he talks about the institutional philosophy, the structures. Are those structures grounded in white supremacy logic? And how are they going to be challenged and disrupted? So I see so many exciting possibilities for this work in distance education and distance and online education. It's really, really very exciting because I can see asking those questions about learning and communication and design within a decolonizing framework, that the possibilities are wide open. And the possibilities really, therefore, connect, I think, in many ways to greater advancement and success for our students. And so I'm going to leave you with a few quotes. And the first one is by Asher. And Asher says, the work of decolonization entails not only our self-reflexive efforts to work through mind-numbing alienation and essentializing divides, but also the commitment to transformation in social and educational contexts. And, I'm going to pay a little bit of attention as I wrap up to this essentializing divides and this whole idea of seeing communities as a monolith, of seeing a certain group of people as a monolith, and therefore creating programs and engaging in practices on that. So that's a great reminder of what the work of decolonization entails as you begin to think about, think through, and I go back again, be intentional about embracing a decolonizing framework. And of course, Mingelo and Walsh reminds us, what does it mean to decolonize? It cannot be an abstract universal. We cannot just put the word decolonizing in front of things and say we're decolonizing. It has to be answered by looking at the W questions: the who is doing it, where it is being done, the why it is being done, and how. And of course, the picture I have that says decolonization is an act of reconciliation is a reflection of the work that we do here in Canada, grounded in the truth and reconciliation with our Indigenous communities. And so as I wrap up this talk, I want to say thank you in as many languages as I can. I am Jamaican by birth, and so I say thank you. That's in my own Jamaican patois, and I hope those who are engaging with us can see their language somewhere here. As I say thank you and look forward to your questions. And again, I just want to thank the organizers so much for inviting me into space. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much. I don't want to take anything away from that. Feeling very provoked right now. The idea of possibilities. How do we begin to really learn again? I think when we talk about decentralizing the teacher, I can see a framework here that says that, well, one way to get close to our students to actually understand them and embed them in our learning is to start learning ourselves, is to have within ourselves this idea that we are learning ourselves and learning about them, and so that's how we can include them. So I'm going to invite Anita to coordinate us in the next week. I know we've run out of time, colleagues. I apologize for that. It was just I was trying to stop Anne at some point, and I thought, no, I can't do that. So I'm just going to invite Anita to just take us through a few questions that colleagues have been asking. Thank you, Anita.
Thank you. Can I just say, Anne, that was just the most spectacularly inspiring talk I've seen for a very long time. Thank you very much. Oscar, was there a question that you specifically wanted to kick off with while I go through the questions and see what we've got?
Okay.
I think there was quite a good discussion going on.
Yeah. Okay. So Linda, how much do you, another 10 minutes, you think?
I don't know. How long have we got?
I think, yeah, 10 minutes would be fine. We need to recognise the audience may need to leave because of other commitments, unfortunately. Yes. But I suspect that we're all also inspired that we want to stay on having this conversation, definitely.
Okay. So
I think Oscar did have something that was a burning question. Did you want to go with that first?
Well, yeah, I think you know what, that has been answered, but I was just going to, it's not a question really, it's a comment maybe that Anne can follow up. You know, this idea of consistency as you work with your theory in decolonization and your engagement in different spaces. How do you manage that consistency in your philosophy, you know, in your upbringing, looking at your ancestral background and bringing that into one place and you know, allowing that to fire you forward, really?
So quickly to answer that, for me, it has been a journey of learning and unlearning. I got a colonial education in Jamaica. So I had to begin to recognize within myself what were those ideas that I was carrying forward that were classist in some ways in Jamaica, you know, it's around classism. What ideas and how did I take those ideas into my teaching and learning? And so I had to begin to ask myself those questions. So I began really that whole journey. So for me, it's that idea of the continuous learning and unlearning. And so quickly my philosophy of education is grounded in equity, decolonizing work, and social justice. So what that does, Dr. Mwenge, it then forces me to ask certain questions when I'm in space. It means that when I always think about how am I being inviting? How am I including histories? Who are my students? And I also invite my students to let me know how I am doing. And so that's why it's called a process, because of course, you know, we have to unlearn some things because we don't operate in bubbles. We operate within our institutions. We operate in society where everyone is not necessarily thinking by us. So my approach is to understand the philosophy, understand what it is you're trying to do, but to also begin to question, to ask, and to know what you don't know. So let me give a simple example. I invite people to help me with the pronunciation of their names. And I say it until I get it. When I was a teacher education, I was reading names at convocation at the University of Toronto. I spent 3 days practicing names, and so many people came up to me after and said, "Thank you so much for taking the time to honor my name." Something so simple, but that's a decolonizing effort. And so ask and learn as you go, and engage in dialogue and conversations. And I think we will be in that process.
I like that. It resonates with me and with my colonial educational background. I think just to really capture the point that says it's not really about getting it, it's the effort of trying to get it. I'm working towards knowing you. I respect your name, I respect your history. This is my effort. Not that I'll get it, but I'm working towards it. And I think that for me, in my different spaces, I found myself has opened up wells and opened up conversations that were very useful. Thank you so much. I'll give it to Anita to take us forward.
Thank you, Oscar. And thanks, Anne, for that answer. Just maybe moving that into sort of a slightly more practical context, because I think what came out strongly from me from your talk was actually we have to do something. We have to actually change our practice. And I'm from a STEM background, and there was a question from Silianos that says, is decolonizing more relevant to some disciplines, e.g. social sciences and humanities? And then a further question from someone else later that was basically saying, from Tim Hall, saying the challenge of decolonizing STEM is the belief that science is objective and neutral. Would you like to sort of comment on those two sort of elements?
Yes.
Some guidance, please.
Yes, because I've had those questions put at me from I was a secondary school teacher. Those who are teaching physics and chemistry would say that's not for us. We are teaching facts here. So when we talk about decolonization, it is undoing coloniality. It is asking questions about knowledge. Whose knowledge, which knowledge? STEM and decolonization looks the same. It is going to be in STEM. It means that in STEM, and I could go on for 2 hours on this, it means STEM more than any else place needs decolonizing, because what has been offered in that discipline is grounded solely in Eurocentric research, Eurocentric ways of knowing. Knowledge from the continent is treated as something exotic. Nowhere in my history or in teaching of math is the contributions of my African ancestors there. What happened in Kemet, their contributions to astrology. So even something as practical as blood pressure, we now know that the way they come up with those numbers, that it doesn't necessarily take into account the differences in Black people. We talk about babies, how they're measured. We could go on. So science, and by the way, I'm going to say there is no such thing as the sort of neutral objective truth. It depends on who is doing that research, who were the subjects, what analysis they made. But because Eurocentric knowledge was so centered, everything that was given to us was taken as sort of the truth. Now we know that Asians have have knowledge to be included in spaces, people from the African continent and so on. So absolutely, when you begin to decolonize STEM, it means you're beginning to question the grounding and framing of Eurocentric knowledge that has ungirded that discipline for hundreds of years. And it needs to happen.
Thank you. And the question from Linda is, how strong is the sense of social justice drive for decolonization? And is this impacting policymakers at an institutional level, a state and national level? Sort of taking it from one extreme to the other, really.
I'm not quite sure I heard all of that. Could you just repeat quickly for me, Anita? I might have missed it.
Yeah, how strong is the sense of social justice drive for decolonizing and its impact on the makers of policy at institutional, state and national level?
Right. So, when we talk about social justice, it's a sort of a all-encompassing, when we say social justice, we could be talking about culturally relevant pedagogy, equity pedagogies, anti-racist pedagogy. It is sort of that broad umbrella. And decolonizing is also a part of what we could broadly frame as social justice, because social justice is all about centering the voices that have been excluded, recentering the voices that were on the margins. It's all about challenging white supremacy that undergirds everything. It's challenging the knowledge in the space. It is naming the perpetuation of inequities and actively and intentionally working to dislodge them. So within institutions, within organizations, within universities, what does that look like? We can do the work without labeling it. Sometimes we get caught up in the labels. If I am saying in my course development, I am going to, in my course, ensure that I have readings from people from the global South. I am going to take up that knowledge. I'm going to give it equal weighting. I am going to treat it as valid and valuable. I am doing the work. And so when you're in your institutions, you have to begin to ask the questions about policies and practices. What have we been doing? How is this advancing those who are marginalized by the system? And those are the questions, because oftentimes sometimes we get into this EDI thing, which I call sometimes just window dressing. So you might have Black, brown people at the table, but nothing is changing. You just have a nice picture. And I say to folks, just take a picture, right? But so the work means challenging the practices and policies around assessment, around, discipline, all the things that we do. How do we do student loans? What does that look like? Whose stories do you believe? How do you treat that Black person that's walking into your office? Do you have a stereotypical prejudgment before you even have the conversation? Oh, there's so many things we could go on and talk about. So we have to challenge the practices and the policies and practices.
Anita, I think, yeah, we've probably got time for one more question.
Yeah, there's two questions, one in the chat. Oh, there's another one just popped up. There's that seem to have something similar. There's talking about the role of language in the process of so I'm just trying to read Datcher's. What's the language control, and yeah, so what the role of language probably in both ways, the language as imposing the colonialism, but also language as in how we use it to sort of deconstruct, de-learn that. Is that unlearn?
Okay, so I'm going to say two quick things about language. So when the colonizers came, the first thing, the colonizers did not just take land, they occupied mind and body. The whole notion of colonization was to make those who they were colonizing believe in the values and knowledge of the colonizers. And so if you look in spaces that were former colonies, and we say former colonies with a sort of thing beside it, if you go to Jamaica, if you go to the continent of Africa, if you go to the education system, is like some old relic from Britain that they're trying to do in a very weird way without. So because they have all these processes in place of exams and all of those things that in many in the West have moved to authentic forms of assessment, but in some countries, we still have children taking exams and 40,000 taking the exam, and we tell 10,000 you are deemed a mark to go to high school. So I could go on and on. So the colonizers also occupied mind. That's why Gugiwe Sango from Kenya says you must decolonize your mind. Begin to believe in yourself. The last thing I'm going to say about language is your identity. And that's why the colonizers did not want my ancestors who they enslaved to read. They didn't want my ancestors that they enslaved to hold a book, because they recognized that with knowledge comes power. And language is your identity. And so I'm not quite sure if that's the way in which the question was framed in terms of the role of language. So what I'm saying here, particularly in England, when you have students from different communities, whether in your face-to-face or your online classes, how are you creating space for them to speak? Are you giving time to listen? Are you listening more? because sometimes, I often say to people, and I know time is going, on the continent of Africa, most people have to speak in a tribal language. Then if they're in Kenya, they have to go to Swahili, then they have to go to English. They're processing in 3 languages before something comes out. But yet we position those people as sort of not educated enough. So, there's so much to say about language. It's a part of our identity. It's a part of who we are. And when we begin to do decolonizing work, we have to value that, just as with names and other aspects of who we are.
Thank you very much.
I hope that's an angle that the person was thinking about. But that was my entry point to that.
Yeah, there's 2 different questions.
Okay.
Right. So I was trying to combine 2, probably not very effectively, but yeah. No, I think Linda, we're out of time now. Is that
we
right?
are, unfortunately, but Tim Hall has just put a question in that actually relates to what happens in our conference tomorrow, which is really helpful. So Tim Hall said that I read that the activities of decolonization and decarbonisation of our institution are interconnected and inseparable. And he asked whether that's a commonly held opinion for those involved in decolonising efforts, which I think is a really good question, but also leads me to say that tomorrow we start with a keynote that looks around climate change education. So it's really nice to see those ideas linked. But Anne, if you just wanted to just for a moment talk about decolonisation linked to decarbonisation from your perspective, that might be very helpful.
You know what I'm going to do with that? I am going to encourage you to read this amazing article by Professor Farhani, and I'm going to look for her now, that talks about decolonizing in the environmental space, environmental justice as a decolonial project. Absolutely. Because, we do not, decolonization is also about space and resources and how we do that. It is that respect for the earth. It's about land and water and all of that. And so decolonization, in fact, connects us or reconnects us to the land and how we use resources. So absolutely, yes, I would say there's a nexus. There's a nexus between decolonization and decarbonization. And I'm really going to encourage you. I'm trying to find her here, or maybe Linda, I will email it to you. That's an article that's a must read. It's one of the best I've read on environmental justice within decolonizing work. It's and challenging coloniality. So I'll send that to you as well, so you can share with participants.
Brilliant. Thanks, Anne. That's really helpful.
And just to add very quickly, Linda, I mean, and I'm sure you'll agree with me that some First Nations had philosophies and ideologies that were more consistent with sustainability than the Western approach to sustainability. And the fact that they've been marginalized was an opportunity that was missed for the earth to be sustainable. So it's one view that definitely came out of my stay in Canada when I was at the University of Toronto. So I have to say thank you so much, and feeling challenged. And you said we have to keep challenging ourselves. We have to keep questioning our practice. We have to keep questioning our processes, questioning our pedagogies. I think it's about feeling comfortable being challenged and challenging one another. That is one of the takeaways that we get from you. And I just want to thank you again. I'm excited for the work we're doing in Zambia because we're meeting in August. And I thank you again. And Linda and Anita, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.